Front subframe time. I'm never gonna finish. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to one more day of me working frantically to try and put the pieces of Bob back together and be on my way on this long-awaited trip of mine. In the process of preparing myself, I'm basically stripping everything apart and I'm trying to make sure that Bob will be able to handle all 13,000 kilometers I have to deal with along the way. In the process of that, it's finally time for me to run checks on my front subframe. It's been removed. I had it sandblasted because I wanted to be able to check if there had been any fatigue cracks anywhere on the subframe, if it was bent, distorted, or if there were any issues with it whatsoever. Luckily, it wasn't bent, no distortion, and I was very, very concerned about that because my suspension cones, these pieces of junk, were long gone, and I've kept these, and I should have never done that. I should have went through the ordeal of replacing these and do what I'm doing now years ago, because these are dead. These are basically solid pieces of rubber, so there was no suspension, so to speak, except for the shock absorbers, and all the forces from the rod were going directly through the subframe to the car, and I had to make sure everything was in order. So far so good with that. Once I'm in the process of going through all these meticulous checks, I figured I was going to reinforce and strengthen the front subframe. I went and did my reading. In doing all my checks, in ensuring myself that Bob's going to make it, and I'm going to make it, I wanted to reinforce the welds on the subframe because the Mini, as it comes as standard from the factory, doesn't have continuous seams of weld in most of the places. So they basically were doing small lengths of weld and then they would skip apart and then do another bit of weld and skip apart and so forth, which was basically to cut down production time and reduce costs. Now, that did not make me feel very comfortable. So I had the whole frame welded, basically, and every single part that was left as a gap, I filled it up. And I've done several reinforcements where you have spot welds on connecting plates between inner and outer plates. I did full reinforcement, full seam of weld around the holes where the upper suspension arms go. And in order to ensure that the frame won't buckle from continuous load and so forth on the road, I added me some small reinforcement corners, one of them on the other side, on both sides of the subframe. And I got as extra, though I didn't ask for it, so the guy I went for the welds told me you should put two small corners here to reinforce and basically connect the towers to the back frame. So I got me a bit of extra in terms of reinforcement. I'm quite happy with the quality of the work done. So now what's left is for me to prime it and paint it, and then I'll be ready to start putting everything back together. One little trick or tip I could provide for the front subframe in terms of upgrades is to make removal of this lower rack, which goes like that basically, underneath the subframe to protect the oil sump from hitting rocks or anything along the road. The way it comes as standard is it attaches through 6 bolts on the subframe, and it goes by means of a bolt and a nut. Having a bolt and a nut means that you need 2 hands. One needs to reach underneath the engine, and the other one needs to go on top from the engine bay, top down, and use two different wrenches to undo this. Reaching underneath is going to be okay. Putting a hand from the top of the engine bay in on a classic Mini means You most likely got to remove the oil cooler, the distributor cover, the front grill, probably the oil filter. Maybe the starter's in the way. It's going to be a mess. And being on the road, if God forbids, I need to remove that for a repair or a check or anything, I want to be fast, I want to be convenient, but most of all, I'm going to be a solo traveler. I need to be able to do this with one hand, and that would be reaching from underneath the car. So I'll be replacing the concept of a bolt and a nut with installation of rivet nuts. So once I'm done priming and painting, I'm going to drill these holes to the appropriate diameter, and I'm going to add me rivet nuts, which means once the rivet nut goes in, I can use one hand to reach from underneath, one wrench or a ratchet, and undo my bolts. And I can remove that without a hassle and without frustration. And the least number of frustrations I can have along the way, the better off I'll be. Let's put this all back together. Okay, so moving on with all the upgrades and changes I'm doing to the front subframe, I want to talk a bit about the trumpets and the front suspension cones. Though I'll be replacing these old pieces of junk with brand new ones, I tried to go for the best possible quality stuff I could get my hands on for road use and for extended use and for a pretty harsh environment that both will be driven in. So I went for the red spot suspension cones, which are supposed to be the best stuff you can find out there. The challenge with them is that you cannot use the original trumpets to install them because they sit higher in the towers than the original cones. So what people do when you install a red spot cone, you have to have a set of high-lows. A set of high-lows is basically, for those of you who do not know or do not have them, is basically a trumpet with a stud and two bolts, and by working on the bolts you can adjust the height and hence fit them into the tower. You can use high-lows as well to alter the overall height of the car. You want it higher, you want it lower, you want it somewhere in the middle, you can use them. Now, I'm trying to avoid as many adjustments and settings and things that could go haywire for the trip, so I didn't want to go with a high-low solution. What I wanted was a fixed trumpet, which of course cannot be the original one because it's too tall, and what I did was I basically made my own. So comparing the two, this is the original Austin Mini suspension trumpet, which basically would fit in a cone, inverted like that, and a knuckle joint would basically transfer the load from the upper suspension arm from the road to the cone. And I don't want to have anything to be adjusted in between. I've had scenarios with at least two of my friends with their minis that they had high-lows. I'm not really sure what quality those high-low sets were, but they would become undone, they would come loose, the nuts would seize up from rust and so forth. So this is something that I wanted to avoid. Hence, I went ahead and with the help of a machinist friend of mine, I made my own fixed trumpets, which are more or less the same concept as the original ones, but this is aluminum. This is a combination of aluminum with steel inserts because I wanted to have, or I did not want to have, the knuckle joint's shaft basically rimming itself through the aluminum from extended use. So I got me some steel inserts in there where the knuckle joint will fit, and that should take my problems away or my concerns away. Comparing the two, basically the ones I've designed are basically 20 millimeters shorter than the original one. The original ones measure a total height of 93.6 millimeters. These ones are 73.6. So I basically, it's kind of like machining away almost 2 centimeters of stuff from the top of a trumpet, and here you have a fixed one which I'll be using. So that's one upgrade I'm doing. The second one, well, not second one, I've run quite a few, is just like using rivet nuts for, and where is my rivet nuts? There you go. For the concept of the protective shroud or the grill for the underside of the subframe, there you go, rivet nut. I figured that in the process of installing the engine, which I'm about to do today, I need to be able to do this thing. If I need to run a repair or anything, I have to be able to do it on my own. I won't have anybody with me, and I gotta be able to rely or design the concept of Bob for this trip, being me, myself, and I, meaning I only have two hands, and I can usually reach from one side at a time, meaning if I need to take the engine mounts off, engine mounts are basically installed on the side of the engine like that, and then here comes a bolt from the outside of the frame, and a nut will go at the back. If you have a bolt and a nut, that means two hands, two tools. It's going to be an absolute pain in the butt trying to have one hand underneath the car somehow to hold the wrench, and then a second one underneath behind the engine to hold the nut. So I'm trying to skip that by installing rivet nuts on my engine mounts. That means that this is now fixed. This is a threaded piece on the engine mount, and as it sits like that, I can only run my bolt from the outside, one hand, one tool, one side of the car, and I can undo the engine. So that should, I hope I won't have to use that. Nothing will go wrong, but in case it does, I have to be able to work on it with one hand and one hand alone. A bit of a concern I also had to do with my lower arm support pins. As I showed in the previous video on the front suspension with my Super Pro bushings and so forth, these were worn really bad. So they are grooved up. As the whole thing was seized up in the lower arm, everything was solid in there because of rust and so forth. This thing was moving inside the female hole of the frame, and I was afraid, I was actually more than afraid, that it would have chewed up my sockets on the subframe. Luckily, and perhaps it was intended to be so, or it was sheer luck, this turned out to be the sacrificial part of the pair. So there was no, it's not worth mentioning the wear that was on the hole. So this, I presume, is made of a softer metal than the metal on the socket on the subframe. So this one eroded away while the socket remained pretty much intact. The only, let's say, adjustment I had to make was, since they have this flat edge on the top, that's to locate the pin to the correct angle, so to speak, of the position in the frame. I used me wedges, and I had an old filler gauge which I no longer use because it's kind of corroded and there's no point of using it to measure thicknesses and so forth, but it fits just nicely on the face of the pin. So I just cut off a piece and put it in there, and that stopped it from moving right and left, and that made installation easy. That wraps up my front frame upgrades and so forth. So the time has come for me, finally, put everything back together, install the subframe in the car, and then the engine, which is there just waiting for me, all ready to go, and I'm done. Τώρα θέλω, έχω κάνει μια μαλακία.